Have you ever sat in a crowded cafe, surrounded by conversation, yet felt completely invisible? Have you ever poured your morning coffee in an empty kitchen and wondered, is this what the rest of my life will be like? Have you ever caught yourself reaching for a second plate at dinner before remembering there's no one else to set the table for anymore? I know that feeling. I know the way it creeps in during the quietest moments, the way it makes the world feel just a little colder, the way it whispers that something is missing. I used to believe that being single at my age meant being lonely, that without a partner, life would feel empty, just passing time until time ran out. But then, something changed. One morning, I found myself sitting alone at a little cafe, sipping coffee extra sweet, just the way I like it. I looked around and saw couples chatting, sharing knowing glances, leaning into each other in the way that only people with history do. And for a second, that ache returned, that familiar longing for something I thought I had lost forever. And then, in the quietest of moments, something shifted. I took another sip of coffee and realized for the first time in years I was drinking it exactly the way I wanted. No one was reminding me to cut back on sugar. No one was rushing me, asking me to hurry so we could run errands. No one was commenting on how I always ordered the same thing. It was just me, my coffee, and a morning that belonged entirely to me. And in that moment, a thought I had never dared to consider before entered my mind. What if being single after 65 wasn't an ending? What if it was the beginning of something I had never truly known? At first, I didn't know what to do with this new sense of freedom. I had spent so many years adjusting my life around someone else that I wasn't sure how to live on my own terms. But slowly, little by little, I started to see that this chapter wasn't about what was gone, it was about what was still possible. So if you're sitting in the same place I once was, wondering if life after 65 means fading into the background, let me share something with you. I once thought being single would be the hardest thing I'd ever have to face. But now, I wouldn't trade it for the world. I spent years blending in, fading into the background like wallpaper, present but unnoticed. My wardrobe reflected it. Muted colors, safe choices, nothing too bold. Nothing that invited a second glance. I told myself it was practical, that I was dressing for my age, but deep down, I knew the truth. I had been shrinking under the weight of someone else's expectations, trading pieces of myself away little by little until there was almost nothing left. Bright colors are too much at your age, my husband used to say. Why draw attention? So I listened. I tucked my favorite red dress, the one that once made me feel beautiful, alive, untouchable, deep into the back of my closet, as if hiding it could somehow erase the part of me that longed to shine. And for years, I convinced myself it didn't matter. But the thing about losing yourself is that one day you wake up and realize you're gone. I didn't notice it happening at first. It was gradual, like a slow erosion, like the tide gently pulling away at the shore until one day the landscape is unrecognizable. It wasn't just the dress. It was the books I stopped reading because he thought they were silly. The music I turned down because he preferred silence. The opinions I swallowed to keep the peace. The dreams I put on a high shelf, promising myself I'd get back to them until the dust settled thick and I forgot they were ever mine to begin with. And then, one ordinary afternoon, standing in my quiet house, I found myself staring at that red dress again. I pulled it from the hanger, held it up against me, ran my fingers over the fabric. It was as beautiful as I remembered. And yet, as I stood there, I felt the weight of every unspoken rule pressing against me. You're too old for this now. What will people think? But then another voice, one quieter but far more powerful, spoke up inside me. Who are you still trying to please? That voice, it wasn't loud, but it was steady. And for the first time in a long time, I listened. That night, I slipped into that red dress, and it felt like stepping into a version of myself I thought was long gone. I walked into a jazz club, my heels clicking against the pavement, my heart pounding like a drum. The second I stepped inside, the old fears returned. They'll stare, they'll whisper, they'll wonder why a woman your age is here alone. But then the music started, and something shifted. No one was watching. No one was whispering. The world didn't stop spinning just because I had finally decided to take up space. And as I sat there, sipping my drink, feeling the music hum beneath my skin, I realized something that shook me to my core. I had spent my whole life making myself small for people who were never even looking. I had silenced my laughter so it wouldn't echo too loudly. I had hidden my joy so it wouldn't make others uncomfortable. I had lived inside the lines someone else had drawn for me, afraid to step beyond them, afraid of being too much, afraid of standing out when all I ever wanted was to belong. But sitting there, in that red dress, in a room full of strangers who didn't care what I wore or how I spent my evening, I understood something I wish I had known all along. I was never too much. They were just too little to handle me. And in that moment, I made a decision. I would never again ask permission to be myself. I would never again trade my happiness for someone else's comfort. I would never again shrink so that others wouldn't have to squint. That's the thing about being single after 65. No one is keeping score anymore. No one is waiting for you to measure up. No one is standing at the door, telling you what's too much, what's too bold, what's too loud. You don't have to explain yourself. You don't have to justify your choices. You don't have to ask if your joy is acceptable. You just get to be bold, bright, unapologetic, and breathtakingly you. And that is freedom. The night I wore that red dress, something inside me shifted. It wasn't just about the color or the fabric or even the freedom of walking into that jazz club alone. It was about stepping into a version of myself I had buried so long ago that I wasn't sure she even existed anymore. At first, I thought that moment was enough, that simply reclaiming the right to be seen, to take up space, would make me feel whole again. But what I didn't realize then was that disappearing isn't just about the way you dress or the way you move through the world. It's about the way you slowly abandon the things that once made you you. And when I finally let myself be honest, I had to ask the question that scared me the most. Who am I now without the roles I spent my life playing? For decades, I was someone's something. A wife, a mother, the keeper of schedules and holidays and late-night worries. My days were filled with to-do lists that never seemed to shrink, with conversations that revolved around everyone else's needs. And I loved my family deeply, fiercely, without regret. But in all of it, I had forgotten how to be someone for myself. I used to write poetry. Not for anyone else, not for recognition, but simply because it made me feel alive. It was my secret world, the place where I could be raw and unfiltered, where my thoughts had room to breathe. I wrote in stolen moments, scribbling words onto napkins, filling notebooks with stories and emotions too big to keep inside. But as the years passed, those notebooks got tucked away. There was always something more important, always someone who needed me more. And so I let it go. One afternoon, while sorting through old boxes in the attic, I found one of those forgotten journals. The leather cover was soft with age, the pages curled at the edges. My own handwriting stared back at me, familiar yet foreign. I turned the pages slowly, reading the words of a woman I no longer recognized. She was fearless, passionate, overflowing with a voice that once refused to be quiet. And as I sat there in the dust and the silence, a thought pressed against me so hard I could barely breathe. I had abandoned her. I had abandoned me. I almost closed the book. The doubts came quickly, sharp as glass. What's the point? You're too old. That part of your life is over. But then I thought of Susan. She lost her husband a few years ago, and instead of letting grief swallow her whole, she picked up a paintbrush for the first time since she was a teenager. I remember the way she talked about it, the way her hands moved as if they were remembering something her mind had long forgotten. Now, her paintings hang in a local gallery, admired by strangers who will never know that for decades her talent had been locked away, waiting for her to claim it again. And so, that night, I picked up a pen. At first, my hand felt clumsy, my mind resistant, like trying to remember a language I had once spoken fluently but had long since forgotten. I wrote a few lines, then stopped. They felt awkward, uncertain. I almost put the pen down, but something in me refused to walk away. The next morning, I wrote again. And then again the next day. The words came slowly at first, then all at once, pouring out of me as if they had been waiting for this moment. I let them come without overthinking, without filtering, without worrying if they were good enough. At first, it was just for me, a quiet ritual, something small but meaningful. But then I got brave. I joined a local poetry group just to listen at first. And one evening, as I sat in a room full of strangers, clutching my notebook, heart pounding in my chest, I heard a voice that sounded like my own, saying, "Read it." I stood up. My hands shook as I turned the pages. My voice trembled as I read my words out loud. And then something incredible happened. People listened. They nodded. They smiled. Some even wiped away tears. And in that moment, I knew I was still here. The woman who once loved poetry, who once found magic in the rhythm of words, who once dreamed of something more, she had never truly disappeared. She had just been waiting. That's the thing about being single after 65. You finally have the time and space to go looking for the pieces of yourself you left behind, the passions you abandoned, the dreams you postponed, the voice you silenced. And when you find them, when you finally step back into the fullness of who you are, it doesn't just feel good. It feels like coming home. There was a time when silence felt like a punishment. It crept in slowly, settling into the corners of my house, filling the spaces where voices used to be. At night, I would lie in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to nothing but the steady tick of the clock. It wasn't just quiet, it was deafening. The absence of sound had a weight to it, pressing against my chest, making the darkness feel heavier than it should. I would reach for the other side of the bed, still expecting warmth, still conditioned to believe that someone should be there. But there was only empty space, stretching out beside me like a quiet reminder of everything I had lost. Mornings weren't much better. I used to wake up to movement, the shuffle of feet, the clatter of dishes, the familiar complaints about the coffee being too strong. Now I woke up to nothing at all. The stillness of the house felt unnatural, almost eerie, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. I hated it. I filled the void with background noise, turning on the television just to hear voices, leaving the radio on even when I wasn't listening. Anything to keep the silence at bay. Then one day, over coffee, I met James. He was in his 70s, a widower, someone who understood the kind of silence I was drowning in. We sat together in a small cafe, the air thick with the scent of roasted beans and fresh pastries, and he told me something I will never forget. I used to hate the quiet too, he said, stirring his coffee absent-mindedly. But one morning I realized something: silence isn't loneliness. It's a luxury. At first, I didn't understand. How could something that felt so heavy, so suffocating, be a luxury? But James smiled, as if he could see the doubt on my face, and continued. For years, I never had a moment to myself. There was always someone talking, someone needing me, someone pulling me in 100 directions. I didn't know what quiet sounded like until I lost it. And then, when I finally had it, I realized how much I had been missing. I thought about his words for a long time. And slowly, little by little, I stopped running from the silence. I let it settle around me, let myself feel it instead of fearing it. And that's when something unexpected happened. I started hearing things I had been too busy to notice before. I woke up one morning and, for the first time, truly listened to the sound of birds singing outside my window. It wasn't just background noise, it was music, soft and rhythmic, a melody I had never taken the time to appreciate. I sipped my coffee in peace. No interruptions, no hurried conversations, just the warmth of the mug in my hands and the quiet hum of the world waking up around me. I took slow walks, feeling the crunch of leaves beneath my feet, inhaling the crisp morning air without rushing to get somewhere. And little by little, I began to see the beauty in the stillness. Silence, I realized, wasn't something to fear. It was something to savor. It was a space to think, to breathe, to just be. It wasn't loneliness, it was freedom. It was the ability to wake up and decide, without negotiation, how I wanted to spend my day. It was eating when I was hungry, sleeping when I was tired, reading for hours without stopping, and indulging in the small joys that had once been overshadowed by the constant presence of someone else's needs. For the first time in decades, my life belonged to me. I think we spend so much of our lives adjusting, compromising, making room for others that we forget what it's like to truly exist in our own space. And then, when we finally find ourselves alone, it feels unnatural, unfamiliar, like a pair of shoes we haven't broken in yet. But then, slowly, we settle into it. We start to see that solitude isn't a void, it's an opportunity. It's a chance to fill our lives with exactly what we want, nothing more, nothing less. And when that realization finally sank in, I understood what James had meant all along. Being single after 65 wasn't the end of my happiness. It was the beginning. If you take nothing else from this story, take this: it is never too late to claim your own happiness. Never too late to rediscover yourself, to step into a life that is truly yours, to rewrite the narrative that others have written for you. So many of us spend years believing that our best days are behind us, that we've had our time in the sun, that now we must settle into the quiet, into the waiting. But life isn't something that simply happens to us, it is something we create, something we shape with every choice we make. And the most beautiful part? At this stage of life, you finally have the freedom to shape it exactly as you want. Maybe, like me, you've spent years putting yourself second. Maybe you've let the expectations of others dictate how you lived, what you wore, what you dreamed of. Maybe you've been so busy being something for everyone else that you forgot how to be something for yourself. But here's the truth I've learned: you are not done yet. The version of you that once felt bold, passionate, curious, and full of possibility, she's still in there waiting for you to open the door. And when you do, when you step into that person again, you'll see that life doesn't stop giving you reasons to smile, to grow, to wake up excited for the day ahead. You'll see that peace isn't something to fear. It's something to cherish. You'll see that there is joy, real joy, in living life on your own terms, in choosing what makes you happy, in filling your days with the things that bring you not just contentment, but deep, soul-stirring fulfillment. So tell me, what is one thing you've done just for yourself since becoming single? What's something that makes you feel alive, free, completely, and unapologetically you? I'd love to hear your story, and I know there are others here who would too. Share it in the comments. Let's remind each other that life after 65 isn't about endings. It's about beginnings. And if the story spoke to you, if it made you think, if it made you feel even a little more hopeful about what comes next, then join us here at Elderly Wisdom Story. This is a place where stories matter, where life lessons are shared, where we remind each other that wisdom is meant to be passed down, not just to the young, but to those of us still growing, still discovering, still living. Hit subscribe, leave your thoughts, share your experience, and let's keep sharing the wisdom that makes this chapter of life so meaningful. Because the best stories, they don't end at 65. They're just getting started.